Hello, everybody. If you're new to our webinar series, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. Criterion Edge runs multiple informative webinars throughout the year. Today's topic is demonstration of sufficient evidence and regulatory strategy alignment in the clinical evaluation process. We are proud to announce that Criterion Edge has been awarded Company of the Year among top regulatory services companies. So how can we help you? If you'd like to speak with us about your upcoming projects or regulatory writing needs, we would be happy to book an appointment with you. You can email us for a free 30-minute consultation at consult@criterionedge.com, or you can book a meeting time directly with the link that we will send in the chat. We have two presenters today. First, I'll welcome Dr. Sarah Chavez, Director of IVD and Scientific Writing Services with Criterion Edge. Sarah has a BS in biochemistry and a PhD in molecular and cellular biology with 25 years of laboratory bench experience and has taught at the university level for 20 years. She has extensive scientific writing experience in an academic environment, as well as for several large textbook publishers. Sarah's strong background in basic research and her extensive experience with regulatory writing will allow her to assist companies with IVDR readiness as part of the Criterion Edge team. Also presenting today is Stacy Beecham, Principal Medical Writer with Criterion Edge. Stacy has a BS in biology and an MS in human physiology with extensive experience in regulatory writing and 10 years of experience in international regulatory affairs. Stacy was a medical researcher prior to entering the regulatory space, where she worked with physicians and scientists at Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. Stacy's expertise in regulatory affairs, submission writing, clinical research, and regulatory consulting for medical device, biopharma, and biotech makes her a valuable asset to the team. Welcome, Stacy. And now I'll hand it over to Sarah to introduce our session today.
Okay, thank you, Olivia. So in today's session, we will be reviewing strategies to effectively evaluate clinical and performance data and how to demonstrate conformity to GSPRs is part of the clinical evaluation process. As a quick recap of our previous webinar, we were focusing on some of the basic definitions of things like legacy, wet, and exempted devices. We touched on the importance of data sufficiency, but we also recognized that this is a topic that a lot of companies struggle with. So in today's webinar, we want to begin with a quick overview of the primary objectives of a CER, and then we'll transition into a discussion of how to effectively present your clinical data and how this data will ultimately be used to support your benefit risk analysis. More specifically, we will address the approach to the CER for some of the devices that are exempt from clinical trials. And then finally, we thought it would be helpful to provide some examples of strategies and gaps that will help to illustrate simple ways to support your own data sufficiency. As part of our recent webinar, we began with a quick review of the clinical evaluation process, and we focused on that stage one, where you identify your data. But as we started to review the questions from our attendees in that webinar, we noticed a very common theme. We all know that clinical data is now a requirement, but how do you actually ensure that the clinical evaluation presents sufficient data? How much is enough? So today we're going to focus on that challenge, and we'll discuss some strategies to help you effectively evaluate clinical data in order to demonstrate conformity. When we help a client to develop a template for their CERs, we begin by developing these 5 main sections. We have a summary, which discusses how your manufacturing organization has concluded that the device has an acceptable risk-benefit profile based on the state of the art. Then we have a scope, and that's a comprehensive overview. It can include technical aspects of how the device works and any specifics related to that device. Then we want to transition into the clinical background. That's where you will include a clear description of how the clinical background sources were selected, and that selection should address any applicable standards or guidance which could impact your device. It will describe how the device fits into patient care continuum by explaining how it falls under this classification of being state-of-the-art, and that will include some of the state-of-the-art medical evidence. The final section here, or section 4, right before the conclusion, you have the device under evaluation section. That is going to be where your clinical data lives, your device data, and it will also include a justification of the conformity assessment with regards to the device risks and the condition risks. So that's where your risk-benefit profile performance requirements will be directly addressed. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, your conclusion. And we find a lot of our clients sort of overlook this very important section. The conclusion should compare the clinical data analysis reports with the manufacturer's safety claims. It should include information and materials and a discussion of the clinical state of the art to help you determine whether or not your materials are consistent or if there are any discrepancies. All of that should be directly addressed and described within the conclusion. The conclusion should include a discussion of any residual risks or unanswered questions and create the case for CE marking. If the clinical data analysis was inconclusive or if there are residual risks, that conclusion needs to address ongoing research and safety activities.
Thanks, Sarah. The first objective of an effective CER is to demonstrate sufficient clinical data. According to NDCG 2020-6, sufficient data is, in simple terms, enough data to prove the device is safe and achieves the intended benefits. Demonstrating conformity to the GSPRs is the second objective, and this relies on an acceptable benefit risk profile based on state of the art. And it is important to note that benefit in this context refers to a clinical benefit rather than a technical benefit. We'll go into that distinction in a little while. The other primary objective of an effective CER is that the device meets measurable safety and performance objectives. These objectives are based on clinical outcomes and data, and this data is extracted from published literature, ideally from a systematic literature review.
Thanks, Stacy. So as you're thinking about that, now that we know the structure and we know the objectives, how can your CER demonstrate data sufficiency and conformity? It's all about keeping track of all these moving pieces. The purpose of the clinical evaluation is to verify safety and performance of the device, but it should also include data supporting the clinical benefits. These data from both the state of the art as well as the intended clinical benefits will be used to identify meaningful performance and safety objectives. And that will be what you'll use to establish the acceptance criteria by which your device will be judged. This entire process involves multiple searches, though, so keep that in mind. These are multiple searches, multiple data sets, and individual analyses that need to be brought together in a single report. So in the broadest sense, establishing data sufficiency in your CER comes down to having a really organized approach and knowing how to fit all of these pieces together.
This is a good time to point out an important distinction. Intended clinical benefit is not the same as an intended technical benefit. A technical benefit, generally speaking, is a performance statement that is not associated to patients in any way, whether patient health or patient management. For example, maneuverability of a guide wire. It is easier on the surgeon, but this benefit is not tied to the patient, so it is not considered a clinical benefit. In addition, it's important to remember that benefits are not claims. A benefit must be clearly supported by the data. We generally like to recommend that you conduct the systematic literature review early in the process so that the information from the state-of-the-art portion of the review is available to serve as the basis for your benefit risk assessment.
So in one of our previous webinars, we went into quite a bit of detail about how to identify measurable objectives and acceptance criteria and how to verify device safety and performance. And in that webinar, we went into detail about how to develop strategies to define those measurable safety and performance objectives. We also included a discussion, though, of the state of the art And according to MedDev 2.7/1 Rev 4, the state of the art will describe what is currently and generally considered to be standard of care or best practice for the medical condition or the treatment for which the device is used. We also have a very helpful white paper on our website that will go into quite a bit of detail, helping to really describe the purpose and the goals of the state of the art section in particular. Analysis and description of the state of the art will provide the context in which the manufacturer and the notified body can assess your safety and performance and determine the acceptability of the benefits and risks. And you're going to do that by comparing your device to other available therapeutic options. So in a sense, the state of the art will embody what's currently and generally accepted as good practice in technology and in medicine. It does not imply the most technologically advanced solution. So please keep that in mind as we move forward. So just to provide a few examples of some of the clinical benefits and quantification, if you look to Appendix A 7.2, and those are letters B and C within MedDev 2.7 Rev 4, that's a good place to find some solid examples of what they consider to be a clinical benefit. But it's important to point out that the type of clinical benefit associated with a device depends on the device under evaluation, as well as its intended purpose. Direct clinical benefits should be supported by your clinical data, whereas indirect clinical benefits could be demonstrated by other evidence, including preclinical or bench data, real-world data, including registries or databases, as well as data from another device that's used in conjunction with the subject device, which may not have a direct clinical benefit. So for instance, using data from a stent to justify safety and performance of a guide wire. So it should also be noted that while those direct clinical benefits should be supported by clinical data, there are other sources of data that can help you support those indirect clinical benefits. So the clinical evaluations will include a combination of both pre-market and post-market data. And as part of the SOA review, this will be the full discussion of your guidelines and standards as applicable, as well as an analysis of competitor data, alternatives data, and ultimately, you will use this to help you support any manufacturer-held data.
In our last webinar, which Olivia placed the link to in the chat, Bridging the Gaps, Determining When Additional Clinical Data is not necessary to demonstrate conformity with GSPRs, we discussed a subset of devices for which clinical data already exists and additional clinical data is not required to be collected under the MDR. These device groupings are devices with well-established technologies, or WET devices, legacy devices, and devices exempted through Article 6110. This means that for devices that fall into these three groupings, clinical data already exists, and the manufacturer can forego collecting additional clinical data specific to their device by leveraging clinical literature, bench testing, and other non-clinical data to demonstrate conformity to the GSPRs. How do the clinical evaluation reports differ for a WET device? Well-established technology is mentioned in Article 52 of the EU MDR, but it's not very clearly defined. Luckily, MDCG 2020-6 Section 1.2 adds a little more clarity and has defined WET as medical devices meeting all of these four criteria. They're relatively simple, common, and stable in design with very little evolution. The generic device group they fall into has proven safety outcomes and has not been associated with any major safety issues in the past. These devices have well-known clinical performance characteristics, and their generic device groups are standard of care devices where there's little evolution in indications or in state of the art, and the device has a long history on the market. If you have a WET device, this enables you to rely on other data sources that we've mentioned to show you have sufficient clinical evidence for your device. So a clinical evaluation for a wet device looks something like this. A thorough evaluation of state-of-the-art, including evaluation of clinical data from equivalent or similar devices, simulated use animal cadaver testing involving healthcare professionals or other end users that would use your device, preclinical and bench testing, and compliance to standards. In other words, you may not find a lot of specific data available for wet devices that have been on the market a long time or have a well-established technology, and there's just not a lot of recent specific device data out there. But the MDR acknowledges that you will use a collection of the available clinical data to demonstrate conformity, along with, of course, most importantly, perhaps, an evaluation of the current state of the art, meaning where your device falls in the current therapeutic landscape, and a justification that your device meets these current standards. Now let's talk about legacy devices. Why would a legacy device, which is a device that has already been CE marked under the MDD or AIMDD, and probably has a long safety record, why would it no longer have enough clinical data to meet MDR requirements? Well, according to the guidance, additional clinical data may be required for your device if changes have occurred in the state of the art in the therapeutic landscape where your device lives. If post-market surveillance data has identified new risks, if the device was maybe not sampled prior to MDD certification or prior to MDR certification during MDD certification, and therefore was not assessed by a notified body, maybe MDR equivalence requirements have changed for your device, or maybe the MDR has redefined clinical data requirements and some of the data sources that you used previously for MDD or AIMDD are now ineligible. In other words, if changes in these MDR regulations impact your legacy device, you may need to adapt your post-market surveillance plan to ensure that the appropriate data is collected and reported to support these new requirements and maybe the changes in the state of the art that affect your device. This will be used in collection with the data that you previously submitted under MDD or AIMDD. Now we're going to bridge over to common gaps that we often see as medical writers in data sufficiency. Your clinical evaluation report at the end of the day should be able to be read and understood by a third party at an agency or notified body. It should include sufficient detail for understanding the data, the analyses, and all of the conclusions that you've reached to demonstrate device safety for sale in European markets. So the primary goal of your CER is to build a strong case for patient safety based on your device's quality. So the first thing you need to consider is, have you exhausted all the data resources that we've mentioned? Have you screened all of the data using a reproducible, methodological, unbiased approach? Have you documented and justified your search methodology, used the correct search strings, justified and documented your date ranges, and used an unbiased approach that is clearly justifiable? And the goal here is to find data, basically, that supports the safety and performance outcomes that you have defined for your device. It is important to demonstrate that these outcomes are also achieved in a real-world setting. Post-market surveillance is especially important to demonstrate risks in a clinical setting. And then the third factor is data presentation. Did you clearly demonstrate your data? Did you clearly explain and justify your analyses and provide conclusions and interpretations so that the notified body doesn't have to extrapolate from the data what these justifications and conclusions really mean? Now let's look at a few examples of how each of these steps could impact your CER. Sarah?
So our first example is that exhausting all data sources. And this really has implications for both a wet or a legacy device, as well as any other device that can't make those claims. Ultimately, your data sources are going to help you support your acceptance criteria. And we actually have a question that someone has posted in the Q&A about, Lauren has asked if the SOTA helps to define those measurable acceptance criteria. At what point should you define those measurable outcome criteria? And really, that's a really good question. And it's something that I think a lot of folks don't think about, because ultimately, this is a process. And the whole idea behind doing the state-of-the-art search is that you are looking for what is currently happening in this field. You're looking for updates to clinical recommendations and guidelines. You're starting from what you know to be true as of now, but the search may in fact reveal additional performance outcomes or safety outcomes that you would want to collect in the future. So conducting that SOA search very early in the process, we've even had clients whose devices were not even developed yet. They were still in development, who have asked for an SOA search to be conducted. And in those instances, it helps them have a full understanding of the scope of the landscape of their competitors and their alternatives and where their particular device might sit. So clinical benefits, which are going to help you, which are going to be justified by your acceptance criteria, they're not just the most commonly reported endpoints. And that seems to be one of the major points of confusion. So often a CER could include data regarding a particular endpoint that focuses on a technical aspect. So did it provide better maneuverability? Did it improve access? Did it reduce procedure time? Those are all important data with regards to the device itself, but are they clinical benefits based on the MDR definition? So think about it like this. Ask yourself if these performance objectives demonstrate the positive impact of the device on the health of that individual, expressed in terms of a meaningful and measurable patient-related outcome, or does it show it just performs as intended in the most technical sense? These clinical benefits can be very much informed by the guidelines and recommendations as well as medical standards. And those are the things that you will identify as part of your state-of-the-art search. Direct clinical benefits should also be supported by clinical data. And that's what you're looking for through these other searches as well. The SOA search will help you identify sets of alternative data. How does one type of procedure compare to another in these bigger buckets? So again, with the guide wire example, if you were to look at PCI versus CABG, those would be alternatives the same patient may have available to them. So you would look at the data for the certain risk factors for PCI versus CABG that you've identified in your SOA search. Now your competitor search is like a funnel. It's bringing it further down into further levels of detail. So now you're looking for, how do my closest competitors compare? How do other guide wires like myself, is their performance data with regards to those in the literature? So ultimately, this indirect evidence may be needed to support that assessment, depending on your device. So that will be obtained through registries or data from another IVD that's used with your subject IVD. So as you can see, there are 3 independent searches. And up until now, we haven't even talked about your subject device search. The SOA search happens, the competitor search, and then the subject device search. But don't forget about looking for those indirect benefits. That in-house data or the non-clinical data can very much help you if you're faced with a small volume of published literature. These alone will not replace the requirement for doing these searches and for looking for data supporting your clinical benefit. And that's really why proper scoping and strategy in designing your searches is absolutely critical. So the next gap is probably one of the more common ones we encounter when we're doing gap analyses for our clients. It's insufficient documentation and description of your systematic literature review process. Again, I would refer you to some of our previous webinars where we've covered in depth what we mean by the state of the art and the systematic literature review. Based on today's discussions of data sufficiency, I just want to point out the purpose of each of these searches again. The SOA helps you identify information pertaining to the medical condition and alternatives. It will also help you identify those clinical recommendations and guidelines, and that will certainly help to inform you about which safety and performance objectives are the most meaningful and can be justified based on the guidelines that have been published. So this search is very pivotal for providing the information you need to establish the current state of the art. And it must be conducted in such a way to be thorough yet precise and meaningful within, as well as being reproducible and unbiased. So, the state of the art search will inform on your risks and benefits, and those clinical benefits must be meaningful within your own quality management systems. The risks also must be clearly documented and assessed in your risk management files. So really, if you have not conducted a proper systematic literature review for the state of the art, it will be nearly impossible to fully support your risks and benefits and show that they are based on sufficient data to support the state of the art. So other approaches to define our acceptance criteria, let's say you don't have a whole lot of competitor analysis. You could also use harmonized standards if available. You could refer to clinical practice guidelines or historic data on the subject device if you are claiming wet or legacy. You could use the state of the art in competitor clinical literature, and that can help you to establish rate ranges and may also include meta-analyses. And so in the instance where the competitor search will be used to determine your acceptance criteria, you must justify the choice of competitors you've included and clearly document how that search was done, as well as how articles were screened and appraised. And that whole process also applies to your subject device search. If your device does not fall into one of these exempted categories, this can be the most frightening search of all, because what do you do if there is no real-world clinical data for your device? This has really been one of the primary challenges we're seeing for some clients as they transition from MDD to MDR. You may get lucky, though, and benefit from the kindness of strangers who've actually reported on the performance of your device in a real-world setting. So that's why that subject device search is also critical. You may not know what's being published about your particular subject device, and this allows you a way to conduct those searches in a meaningful way. Which brings us to this third gap, and that's where many companies fall short in establishing their data sufficiency. It comes down to the data presentation. If you are new to the CER writing process, this step can actually be one of the most time-consuming and also can result in many mistakes in our experience. It sounds so simple. You identify data, you present your data, and you end your report, but it comes down to not only having a good, solid organization, but also a strong template. If your search results in hundreds of hits, you are not necessarily going to want to go through every single one of those articles one by one and list them in a narrative form. The notified body is not going to want to sift through hundreds and hundreds of pages of data documenting each and every article you identified. They expect your argument to be organized and very succinct and very well laid out and convincing. So I wanted to provide sort of a side-by-side comparison to help illustrate these three main gaps using a specific example. So suppose you have a task of writing a CER for a drug-eluting stent. You conduct all the searches and you have a stack of articles now that are sitting in a folder for you to start to screen on your desktop. If you go to PubMed and you type in drug-eluting stent, you get close to 19,000 articles. So you could try to summarize those, but no one wants to do that. That is way too many for the notified body to consider to be a reasonable search. So your next option is to start to refine your search. So you can use filters that help you search to maybe the past 5 years. You could also limit it to clinical trials, randomized control trials, and meta-analyses. Now that would bring that 19,000 down to 813 results. So that sounds better, right? I'm willing to bet, though, that no one here has time to sit down with even 800 articles to find the ones that contain extractable performance data. So during that scoping process, we recommend that you work closely with your reference librarians to identify proper mesh terms and limits that will help you capture data that's specifically relevant to your PICO terms, where PICO stands for patients or population, indications, comparators, and outcomes. Incorporating those terms into your searches can help immensely. Within the SOA section, we describe in detail how each of these searches are conducted, including the date that the search was run, the number of databases we searched across, not just PubMed, the search limits and strings, as well as the output. And we clearly document each of these searches independently and then provide detailed explanations of the exclusion criteria we use to then screen these articles. That could include very simple reasons for exclusion, such as a duplicate or an off-topic article, or it could exclude an article that uses devices in a particular population or anatomy that's not currently covered under your IFU. But all of that must be clearly documented and presented for notified body review. So now let's suppose you have the opposite issue and you run the search for your indication or device and you find nothing. What can you do then? Again, this is an opportunity for your librarians to become your best friend. They will help you recheck your search strings and expand the search. Searching across multiple databases and platforms and identifying relevant professional organizations may help you identify clinical practice guidelines. Start by looking for solid systematic literature reviews and meta-analyses that can help to provide that historical perspective, particularly if your device has a long history on the market, but they'll also help to provide insights as to some of those measurable safety and performance outcomes. Also, don't forget to check those registries or in-house data. In some cases, there just might not be a lot of new research on your device in the past 5 years. But what that doesn't mean is that you can state that your search term turned up nothing. Clinical data is a requirement, it's not an option. So you should be prepared to justify your search approach to convince the notified bodies that you left no stone unturned. And I also want to point out that this is not necessarily an all or nothing issue. In some cases, you may find plenty of data for one population or indication, but you can't find any reported data for another. That too could be an issue that will affect multiple sections within the CER. So knowing this early by conducting a proper SOA search and competitor search may really help you develop a regulatory strategy that can address those shortcomings head on as part of your CER planning process. So now let's show how you can demonstrate that your screening was sufficient. If you didn't properly document your search and your methodology, it's going to be impossible to justify the data set that you're using to support not only the state of the art, but also the ranges that you're calculating for your safety and performance objectives. And that could ultimately call into question the acceptance criteria. You must document the process of the screening to ensure that you have not just picked the articles that happen to present your technology in the best light. And finally, the third issue that we commonly encounter is that issue of data presentation. Going back to that example of drug-eluting stents, suppose you screened articles and came up with only 20 of those articles had extractable performance data. You could take each of those 20 articles and summarize them in a paragraph form. This article looked at this population and this many patients, and they found vessel dissection occurred in 2% or technical success in 98%, et cetera, et cetera. That is one approach, but it can be extremely long and tedious. And so ask yourself, would I want to read this? And even if I did read this, would I understand what all of this data really means? In my experience, when this approach is taken, it often lacks a solid conclusion or an analysis that allows the notified body and the reviewers to properly demonstrate or to locate those ranges that are based on each of those 20 paragraphs that you've likely spent many hours writing. And that's not to say that the summaries aren't useful and necessary. You should certainly include summaries of the data with enough details to allow for that thorough comparison. So what I'm suggesting is that sometimes the data tables can also be your friend. Document the study details as well as the carefully selected safety and performance objectives. Use that table to help you calculate a range that can help to support the acceptance criteria based on the current competitive landscape. In some instances, you may want to stratify the data to calculate separate ranges for each vessel. If the stent is indicated for a large vessel versus a small vessel, clearly the risk is going to be different, the risk of adverse events. So if you have patients who are symptomatic versus asymptomatic, the symptomatic patients may be in a higher risk class. By stratifying the data in this tabular format, it allows you to provide an additional level of detail that can be extremely valuable for supporting your data sufficiency, but also your risk-benefit analysis. So again, I would refer you to one of our previous webinars on that, performance objectives and acceptance criteria, for additional details, because we just don't have enough time to really discuss how to determine those ranges today. But I just want to focus instead on the importance of transparency and reproducibility in this entire process. You may encounter studies that report unfavorable data, or if there may be two studies that result in conflicting results. Sometimes there could be even disagreements between clinical practice guidelines. By conducting effective systematic literature review processes, it ensures that all data, good or bad, is assessed and that the results are extracted, appraised, and assessed, and a conclusion is drawn. So discuss the data in a very clear and objective and unbiased way, and be prepared to draw conclusions based on this data set.
That concludes the presentation part of our webinar, and we will be moving on to Q&A soon, but we hope in review of this session that we were able to provide relevant advice and insights as to the primary objectives of an effective CER, as well as the importance of defining measurable safety and performance objectives. Also, the difference between a technical and a clinical benefit, and how the clinical benefit is used in the benefit risk assessment, and also helps to support your choice of safety and performance objectives. We also hope that we have conveyed the importance of a methodological and validated systematic literature review, including a state-of-the-art review, and the implications of wet and legacy device classifications on various sections of your CER. Finally, we hope to have identified and given examples of common gaps to avoid when assessing your clinical data. We'd now like to move on to take some time to answer the questions that you have sent in.
All right, thanks, Stacy. We had a huge number of people register for this webinar and a big turnout today. So we took some time to review some of your questions ahead of time. And if you have questions now that the presentation is done, please go ahead and send them in using the Q&A button, and we'll answer them in the order that we received them. All right, our first question today: is there a standardized definition for the terms PMCF study, clinical investigation, etc.?
Yes, I can take this one. The MDR regulations do refer to these terms, but they don't really explicitly lay out the definitions or the relevance, I guess. But luckily we have the MDCG guidance documents, and they do a better job of defining, explaining these terms and relating them to, common situations. So I'm going to pop in the chat here a link to MDCG 2020-6 and MDCG 2020-7, both refer to the different terminology that we use around clinical investigations and post-market clinical follow-up, post-market surveillance studies, things like that. And I hope that's a useful tool.
All right, great. Thanks, Stacy. Let's get to our next question here. It's sort of a two-parter. The first question: how do you define state of the art? Is it the treatment currently most frequently used or the best available? And can you discuss strategy where limited subject device data may not align with safety performance outcomes found in the state-of-the-art review?
Yes, I think the easiest way to think of the state of the art is sort of the current state of all competitive treatment options. So this is really why that state-of-the-art search is so valuable to you and your organization. It's going to help you establish where your device fits into the entire landscape. So even for wet technologies or for legacy devices who have previously not had to provide any clinical data, it's the reason why they require this state-of-the-art search and this assessment is that technologies change. New devices are brought to the market, new treatment options become available. So while your device may perform exactly as it always has over the past 30 years, there could be new benefit risk balances that are achieved over the life of the device. It could also mean that maybe a particular risk or a benefit arises after the device has been used over the lifetime of a device. So the state-of-the-art search will help you to not only identify what's currently out there as far as your alternatives, but also if there are any new risks or benefits that are being discussed in the literature. So it's really important to document that you did your due diligence to find that. And there's actually a similar question in the Q&A button right now about what do you do if there is no data on the subject devices or similar devices? What can you do then? We actually encounter that quite a bit. So when that happens, what you will basically be relying strongly on is that state-of-the-art search. You can look to how the type of device that you are using performs compared to other alternative devices. So rather than having specific competitors that you've identified, you will rely strongly on the sort of the long history of the device in theory. If it's a brand new device on the market, that can be equally challenging, but by showing how the competitors perform or the alternatives perform, it will allow you to at least develop a bar by which your device will be judged. That being said, it is expected that your subject device data will have clinical data. It's a requirement. So you may need to start collecting data in some ways, either through post-market surveillance or through registry data, or even conducting a clinical trial. And I know that's not what everyone wants to hear, but in some cases, if there isn't any data and you identify that there's a lack of data over and over and over again, that may become necessary.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Our next question is coming from Beatrice. What is meant with screen all the data? How many and what type of databases should one use at a minimum? And Sarah, what would you say to this question?
Yes, I think in a way, there really isn't a standard approach. The way that we have found that's the most effective, we actually use a platform called ProQuest Dialog. It allows us to search across multiple databases simultaneously, which naturally builds in efficiencies into the whole process. So our librarian is able to simultaneously search across Medline, Embase, PubMed, and even some of the smaller databases. So for those organizations that have a device that doesn't have a lot of data, that may help you drum up or dig up some of that elusive data. I would say as a minimum, you want to make sure that you can justify your choice of database. And by screening, we mean that if you have identified 100 articles in your search, you're expected to go through and check out and screen each of those articles. So you should check the titles and see if they're relevant. If you decide you are not going to use that article, you need to be able to justify why that article was excluded using a very specific criteria that you've pre-established. So that allows you to be unbiased because you go into the search saying that I'm only going to look for devices that are used in this anatomy. If it's used in a different vessel that I'm not indicated for, I can exclude it. So you can basically go through article by article using your predefined exclusion criteria and state, I'm only looking for articles that present human data within the past 5 years that are in a particular population. Maybe you exclude pediatrics or you include pediatrics. it's going to make sure that you have a set rule by which you are going to decide. And if articles meet all of your rules, that they cannot be excluded, you should be prepared to present and include that data as part of your analysis.
Great answer, Sarah. Thanks. All right, our next question is from Lee, and he would like to know, how can we assess if the regulatory strategy can adequately support the clinical evaluation plan for my device? Stacy, do you want to take this one?
Sure, great question. Well, first of all, I think it depends on how you view the definition of a clinical evaluation and regulatory strategy. You can look at it from a few different angles, but your clinical evaluation plan is the process you're going to use to evaluate all the clinical data and information that is available or that needs to be compiled or collected or conducted even for your device, right? So we take our clinical evaluation plan and then we execute the clinical evaluation, and then we write a clinical evaluation report. And the regulatory strategy really relies on the state of the art. Where does my device fall in the therapeutic landscape? How does my device compare to other options, other therapeutic options, alternative options, comparative options? Where do you fall? And what is a regulatory agency or authority or even a notified body looking for from you? What are they looking for in your regulatory strategy? So I like to start at the end and say my final goal here is to have a convincing and justified CER that verifies that this device meets the general safety and performance requirements. So once you define those safety and performance objectives based on the state of the art and the literature review, then you show that your data can measure up to the data from similar or equivalent devices. You show how it compares to alternate or competitor devices as well. And then your clinical evaluation is supported. Now, as far as the regulatory strategy, if you're talking about classification or, the risk level, those pieces, just identifying those measurable safety and performance objectives, and then justifying how your data supports that automatically supports your clinical evaluation plan. The other piece then is to make sure that you tie all these concepts together with those clear justifications, and as Sarah said earlier, tabular format for your data and analyses and stratifying data. Just make sure that conclusion really presents in a very clear and concise manner how your clinical evaluation supports the regulatory strategy that you outline for your device.
Great, thanks, Stacy. Here's our next question from Lauren. What is the best method to determine measurable clinical outcomes?
So in my experience, sometimes you can go to the group that is actively collecting data on your device, and they will say, we have data on this objective and that objective. That's a good place to start, but I also like to go to those clinical practice guidelines first and foremost. And actually, those often help me identify the proper terms that I want to make sure I include in my SOA searches. The guidelines are typically based on the safety and performance of a particular device compared to other devices. So you will start to notice that there are certain ways that the data is reported within those clinical practice guidelines. There may be some instances where you may go into the state-of-the-art search and your entire CER planning and preparation thinking you're going to collect certain types of data and then realize no one reports that measure. Maybe they report it slightly differently. So as part of that data extraction process, if you have the state-of-the-art done ahead of time, it can save you a lot of time during the data extraction to make sure that you have identified all of the measures that you're going to commonly encounter and are going to be valued by professional organizations.
All right. Our next question is from Robin. Robin is asking, what is an acceptable level of post-market data to support clinical requirements?
Yeah, these are difficult. Acceptable levels, sufficient data. It's all arbitrary, I guess,
Mhm.
based on, based on your definition of your performance and safety goals. It just really depends on what are you trying to prove. So once you've defined safety and performance outcomes or goals that are, relevant and appropriate for the risk class and the indications and population for your device, now you have to prove that your data justifies that you meet all of those outcomes that you've established. So when you're looking at current requirements, which are MDR requirements, you need to identify the current state of the art, any new technologies, any changes in standards and regulations, changes in the general therapeutic landscape. And then you need to show that your device meets the medical need that it's intended to meet for the population that it's intended to treat. Despite these new offerings and new state-of-the-art standard of care options that exist, will you be planning device improvements based on the new therapeutic landscape that may exist, based on new products that are on the market? You need to identify those and include those in your post-market surveillance plan. And you might need to conduct more studies. You might need to do an updated literature review. You might need to examine, these elements to make sure that they support the new MDR clinical requirements. So it's difficult to say what an acceptable level is, but I can tell you that as long as you're adjusting it to the current standards under the current regulations, the current requirements, then in justifying it, then that should be sufficient.
Okay, thanks, Stacy. Our next question is from Julie. Julie is asking, can you make a state-of-the-art without an indication for a specific disease, like a device that's a pen injector used for multiple indications? And Sarah, how would you interpret this question?
Yes, this can definitely be challenging. We have had a few of these come up recently, and it doesn't require a slightly different approach. In my experience, the best approach would be to think about ultimately what is your device doing. So that if this is a pen injector, you would want to state how the pen injector provides the level of either drug delivery or, like, assuming it's drug delivery, how it's going to provide adequate drug delivery, and what are the other methods for drug delivery systems. It could be just sort of a traditional syringe-based method, it could provide more accuracy. So you wouldn't, in terms of the medical condition, you would probably want to go into some details about sort of, why is that method of drug delivery, injectable method, when is that needed, under what broad circumstances, different ways of injecting, intramuscular, intrapleural, intradermal, and then go into your alternatives for how you can deliver that drug. So you can keep it very broad. You wouldn't have to go into extreme amounts of detail, but then when you get to your table, make sure that you're extracting data with regards to what was being delivered, like what was the tissue, what was the site of injection, what was the delivery, and coming up with ways of quantifying how effective that particular delivery was, because that could change depending on if you're injecting insulin or if you're injecting some other medication, the end results could be quite different.
All right. Our next question is sort of a two-parter. I think this one came from someone registering for the webinar. So here it is. How can you demonstrate sufficient clinical data with devices with no data at all, but with more than 20 years in the market? My device is on the market for the past 20 years. Do I need a clinical study for this legacy device? Stacy, what would you have to say to these two people?
Sure. I'm going to answer the second one first. And we did kind of cover this in the presentation, but you'd need clinical study for your legacy device if changes have occurred due to the MDR regulations or in the therapeutic landscape as identified by state of the art that would impact your device or the therapeutic options your generic device category. So for example, if post-market or if changes have occurred in state of the art, if MDR equivalence requirements changed, if MDR redefined clinical data requirements and the data requirements sources or requirements that you used that you measured up to in the MDD, AIMDD certification process no longer meet the requirements for MDR or no longer can be used, or if post-market surveillance data has identified new risks. So for any of those reasons, if any of those apply to you and your device and the therapeutic group device that I guess grouping that your device belongs to, then yes, you would need a clinical study. You need to collect additional clinical data. Otherwise, if those, and if you haven't had a significant change, then you could probably use existing clinical data for your legacy device and forego the clinical trial. Now, for the first question, no data at all. That's a tricky one, but we do. If it's a well-established technology, then you can rely on other data sources like we've explained before. And I think we've kind of outlined those in this presentation. But if it is not considered a well-established technology, then you might have to conduct clinical trials to answer the first question there. If you have no data at all, that's specific to your device.
All right, we have just a couple of minutes left, so we'll try to get to a few more questions. Here's the next one. Do you have any advice for rare diseases and the difficulty of gathering clinical samples for a clinical performance study? There is no data on the scientific literature search.
Yes. So if you happen to fall into this grouping here, what we've often encountered is that the level of evidence as far as the data sets that you're including might be a little bit lower than something that's a very, very common disease, just given the total number of patients that you're seeing. I would definitely be on the lookout for a meta-analyses. They may be, again, hard to come by, but you could also be on the lookout for case series or case reports, or there may be some disease registries that could also be helpful. It can be extremely challenging to gather enough patients to conduct a full clinical performance study for rare diseases. You can also look at basically how your device performs in other populations, and then state the limitation of that particular disease by justifying sort of the prevalence in the population as a reason why the disease why there is limited clinical data. But be prepared to have an explanation of sort of what you can do, what sort of other indirect benefits or indirect data that you can also be collecting to help you justify this particular treatment.
I think we have time for one last question. And these two from the chat are sort of similar, so I'll put them up together. If your medical device has an indirect clinical benefit as part of the system, can studies of the system be used? And is the structure or content of the CER impacted if the device is a combination product? How?
Sure. The first one I think Sarah addressed in the presentation as well, indirect clinical benefits versus direct clinical benefits. If the device is could be considered a component of a system, but as a standalone device, there's not much data that exists. You have to look at whether you're writing the CER at a system level or at a device level. If you're writing it at the device level and it could be considered a component, you might want to adjust your perspective or take a different approach to assess the direct clinical benefits, to maybe drum up some literature or some data that would speak to the direct clinical benefits as a standalone, as well as the indirect clinical benefits as part of the system. And then the second one there is the structure or content of the CR impacted if the device is a combination product. There is guidance. I think, Olivia, will you pop that in the chat, please? There is guidance about combination products. I think the most sticky aspect of that is for the drug, if it's a drug device combination product, the pharmaceutical trials or studies are structured a little bit different, have different requirements than a device study. And you just have to make sure that the pharmaceutical aspect of the study is structured like a device study would be. So toward the requirements of the combination product from the device side. And you'll see that if you read through that kind of explanation of the guidance that Olivia popped in the charts, but it's all about the data collection methods and if it was structured for a combination product or if it was structured for a pharmaceutical product. So there's a little video there that explains the difference, and I think it could be very useful.
All right, thanks, Stacy. We are out of time. Thank you so much, Sarah and Stacy, for your presentation today. For more questions on the content we discussed today, or if you'd like to learn about our services, you can schedule a free appointment with our specialist. Our contact information is consult@criterionedge.com. Thank you, everyone, for attending and for all your questions. We hope this presentation brought you more clarity surrounding clinical and performance data sufficiency and how to approach the clinical evaluation report. Have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you next time.